Hey everybody, I apologize for the absurdity of the last 10 minutes of part one of week three. It just evolved into kind of an untenable situation here with barking, running dogs and frantic clicking to attempt to get out of my PowerPoint and figure out what was going on. And it was just a little bit of a tough time, but one is still learning how to deal with these technologies, and computers have to run updates and all things sorts of things go on. So I do apologize for that, but here is the second half of our lecture on the week three material, all the big takeaways I'd like you to get. And we just talked about the Leyenda Negra, or the Black Legend of Spanish colonization. And part of that Black legend revolves around some figures that have historically at times been treated as heroes. And here they are here. They are the Franciscan missionaries of the Spanish Empire. And the Franciscans were a type of Catholic priest. I say type because there are many, many types of Catholic priests, and we're going to be learning about another one called the Jesuits very shortly, and they're actually the subject of much of my scholarship as a historian. So I look forward to sharing their story with you. But the Franciscans were another type of priest. They are missionaries. And what are missionaries? They are people who are on a mission to do something, to fundamentally transform the world in the name of God. And the Franciscans were among the first, along with another group called the Dominicans, to come to the New World with the Spanish conquistadors and with Spanish administrators, and later when Spanish colonists come as well, to fulfill their mission, which was to convert native peoples to Catholic Christianity. And in many cases, they end up playing right into the hands of the conquistadors. So they are charged with not allowing native people to be enslaved by the conquistadors. So, and also by kind of Spanish settlers who aren't part of the church. So how do they avoid that? By building what are called missions, which consists of a church and a cloister for the priests to live in, or what you might call a priory, actually, and growing fields and dormitories. And they invite Native people to come in and live in these missions. In actuality, the Native people are often forced to come into these missions, and they're trading one sort of slavery for another. The Franciscans could be very, very brutal in terms of stamping out Native American beliefs and trying to replace those beliefs with their understanding of Catholic Christianity. And they often do so with corporal punishment, and with threat, and with separating children from parents, and with forced labor. So many of these mission properties to this day dot the west coast of the United States. They were places where some people, feeling that the old gods and the old religious ways deserted them, embraced Catholic Christianity and thought, well, these people aren't really suffering that much. Let's give this a try. But others were forced to outwardly conform to Catholic Christianity or face severe punishments if they did not do that. I word it this way because my question, as always, is, can anyone really force you to convert in your heart and your mind? They might be able to force you to stop carrying an object that reflects your religious belief, of singing a song, or doing a prayer, or performing a dance that reflects your religious belief. But can they really kill that belief within you through force? The consensus seems to be no, but the outward killing of those beliefs really is almost what we could consider a cultural genocide that unfolds at these Franciscan missions, which really were supposed to be places of refuge, and very quickly become places that seem to imitate kind of some of the most egregious abuses of the lay conquistadors. To give you a point of scale, though, not all colonizers are alike. Not all religious approaches are alike. Not all Catholics are alike. So we have Spanish Catholic Christianity being rather warped during this first century of New World invasion, conquest, and settlement. It was conditioned by war. It is warlike. Nonconformity is punished brutally. And yet at the same time, you have other Catholics from other parts of Europe behaving very differently with Native people. So we'll get to some of those nuances in the week to come. So, of course, this is a course on colonial and revolutionary America, and so often that story is treated as something that unfolds on the northeast coast of the United States and then very steadily moves westward. Well, we're taking a more continental approach, and in our story of American development, which if some of you are interested, you can take the second half of, which goes up to the Civil War next semester, really has to take into account all of America. So we were just talking about those Franciscan missions. And by the time the Spanish have been in the New World for 2 centuries, we have a tremendous string of these missions, stretching from Mexico, going all the way up to almost north of San Francisco Bay, which would have been the northernmost reach. And it's there that Native people live under the influence of the Franciscans, do work at their behest or at their requirement. They are clothed, they are given religious instruction, whether they really want it or not. And yet, in times of health, and I stress this because we all really know what epidemic disease can do to communities these days. At times of relative health, though, these become the places that preserve Native American culture. They bring people together and they keep people relatively safe. So those behaviors that the Franciscans considered non-threatening to their religious outlook or the religious instruction that they hope to give to the Native peoples are going to have the odd consequence of being preserved at these mission sites. And this is kind of part of the story of what becomes California and the regions of the American Northwest in the 19th century. These realities of the symbiotic connection between Europeans and Native people will come up against what it has been for Anglo-Euro-Americans, those from England or from English-speaking traditions, and their traditional methods of connecting or causing war with Native peoples. And they're going to be 2 very different ways of coming together. What else can I say about some of these symbiotic connections between Europeans and Native Americans? Well, first of all, it's very, very important to remember that not all Native people see Europeans as a threat immediately or see them as potentially useful allies against other enemies, and that is going to be a pretty continuous process in Spanish America during most of the colonial period. And I'll explain why in a little bit. It's odd in the sense that in the English New World, there is also not a strong sense between us and them when Europeans from England encounter Native people. So we get that same thing, but very quickly that will change to an us and them. So we have these first encounters unfolding in the English colonies in 1607 in a robust way. By the time we get to 1676, it's going to be quite a different story. In actuality, the Spanish and native people in many ways come together more closely and more intimately as the end of the 16th century gives way to the 17th century, and different realities and different feelings about people coming together, living together, and learning off one another. And that is the purpose of this image over here. This is a native woman who's weaving, and the interpretation of this is that she's actually showing a Spaniard how to make cloth using traditional Native American methods. And the Spaniard is kind of looking at this and thinking about how this might be useful to the Spanish New World. As we know, Spanish culture, even Spanish culture back in Spain, is highly, highly inflected by its New World experiences and also its experiences with Islam and Judaism, even though these were people that Spanish Catholics tried to oppress, and often successfully and horrifically did oppress. So on one hand, you have the destruction of culture. On the other hand, you often have the appreciation or the adaptation, the borrowing, adding, and adapting of culture as well. So let's talk about how the Spanish are going to move in the Americas. And they really do start out as the explorers par excellence. And as I said before, they are not exploring for exploration's sake. They are exploring to find exploitable resources. They are exploring because they want to increase Spanish influence. And also there is often, though not always, that religious dimension to that. It should also be noted, and this is very, very, very important, and I've said it before, the Spanish crown back in first Toledo and then Madrid is not always sanctioning what the New World Spanish are doing. Sometimes they have no knowledge of it. Many times, Spanish expeditions are going to be financed and set off from New World ports, places. They'll be staged from Cuba. They'll be staged from the island of Hispaniola over here. They will not be staged with any real knowledge of the Spanish back in Spain until it's a fait accompli. But that tells us something, that when people come to the New World, they tend to press the limits of what they're allowed to do, supposed to be doing, expected to do, or can do without getting into any trouble by colonial authorities or by getting into any trouble from the Spanish crown back in Spain. What this will lead to is a tremendous free-for-all of Spanish exploration, as we see by all of these squiggly lines here. So we see Ponce de Leon, Juan Ponce de Leon, who is in search of a kind of a mythical set of ideas, one of them being a fountain of youth, one of several things he was looking for, believing that that existed very far north of Mexico in a peninsula that he calls Florida, or area of the flowers, that we know today as Florida. And we see the Spanish coming into Florida and really establishing a permanent presence there from 1565, the oldest city of European origin in America is actually St. Augustine, which we see marked on the map here with this little black dot. And then we see Hernando de Soto, who stages his invasion from Cuba, and again looking for gold, looking for riches, looking for new people to conquer in the name of Spain, does this huge loop around Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Actually, he is killed somewhere here on the Mississippi River, presumably in Arkansas, or what is Arkansas. That seems to be what the record suggests. He was possibly done in by his own men because he was an utterly loathsome individual who made enemies of native peoples and enemies of his fellow Spaniards wherever he went. And then the expedition carried on and goes all the way into Texas. We see the fascinating, I'll skip Cabeza de Vaca for a minute, the fascinating journey of Francisco de Coronado, who is looking for 7 mythical cities of gold that he is convinced exist north of what is called New Spain to the Spanish, which really is Mexico. So Coronado's trip is a fascinating one because, first of all, he makes it through this very rugged territory with a significant detachment of individuals, and he's encountering Native American villages. And he basically says to them, well, do you know where the 7 cities of gold are? And they say, in their best ability to communicate with one another, oh, not here, but you might look over, you know, in that direction to the northeast. There might be something there. So Coronado heads in that direction. And he hits another village, and this other village looks likewise pretty modest, and he raises the same question. Do you know where the 7 cities of gold are in there? Oh, not here. You don't want to stop here. You want to go on to this other place. And as you can see, they make it all the way up to modern day Kansas. And basically native people at this point, through word of mouth, through travel, through some knowledge of what's happening in the southern part of the Americas, know that these people are not to be trusted, are potentially very dangerous, and rather than confronting them, it's better to give them some approximation of what they want and get them out of your community. That's basically what Coronado's voyage is. The expedition of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca is something very different, and we might look at the sum total of all these explorations and the fact that there is a lot of injury done to native people, a lot of theft, a lot of abuse, some outright killings, killings of fellow Spaniards when they became inconvenient and asked inconvenient questions. And might just think that this was this kind of free-for-all, or this is just who the Spanish were in the 16th century. But then we see glimmers of change and glimmers of difference, a different way of being, a different way of thinking, a different way of being a colonizer. And we see that in the story of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, illustrated right here. And here's Cabeza de Vaca's story. He is part of an expedition by an explorer named Alvar Panfilo de Narvaez, who stages in Cuba and off the coast of Florida. Cabeza de Vaca and his company and Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition encounter what we believe to be a hurricane, and a really awful hurricane. It just completely rattles this expedition. It splits up the vessels. Some of them hit the coast, or they're grounded in sandbanks and they break apart. The people drown, or if they manage to get off, they build these little rafts and then they float off and are never seen again. Cabeza de Vaca does manage to survive with a couple of companions. He never sees his other members of the expedition again, and yet he and a few survivors make it to the coast of Florida, the west coast of Florida, near Pensacola. And what they encounter are native people who really don't want them there. they're hostile, and it's the Spanish who are enslaved. The tables are turned on them. The local Caracawa Indians turn them into slaves. According to Cabeza de Vaca, who wrote a fascinating text about this, treat them with great harshness, but then kind of tire of having the Spaniards, the Spanish retinue, which, by the way, contained a Spanish man of color by the name of Estebanico with them. So they kind of trade them to another native group, and that other native group trades them to another group, and they end up kind of moving around the Gulf of Mexico. And as this is happening, Cabeza de Vaca is learning more about the people he's encountering and their culture. He is learning how to communicate more effectively. He is learning how to apply some of his learning as a kind of a makeshift self-taught doctor to heal Native people who are sick, and he's having some success as a healer. So by the time he gets to Louisiana, he and his retinue have developed this following, this cadre of Native friends who believe that Cabeza de Vaca is this, at very least, this very interesting person with great healing talent, that he's somebody to cultivate, and they move him safely from point to point to point as he tries to reconnect to the Spanish Empire. The end result of this is almost 8 years of wandering for Cabeza de Vaca, his fellow Spaniards, and the Native American friends he makes along the way. And they go with him. They're kind of committed to seeing his journey to an end. At the end of 8.5 years, he and his friends encounter a detachment of Spanish soldiers in what was then called Alta California. And they explain who they are, and the Spanish are greeted by these soldiers and taken in. The Native American allies of Cabeza de Vaca are kidnapped and enslaved. And Cabeza de Vaca is just horrified by this. He eventually makes it back to Mexico City, where he writes his famous narrative In English Castaways, and becomes a tremendous critic of the way Old World peoples are treating New World peoples. And he is not the only one who feels this way. At roughly the same time that Cabeza de Vaca is writing, so are two other men. One man by the name of Bernal Diaz, who had been a conquistador himself and was appalled by the cruelty and the bloodshed that he witnessed. Another by the name of Bartolome de las Casas, who was a priest and who came to the New World, had an enslaved Native American servant as a child, and then when he comes to the New World, he is appalled by the abuses, saying we should be trying to win these people over with love instead of through abuse, which shows you that the first century of the Spanish could have complex reactions to the New World situation, and Native people had complex reactions to the Spanish. Some know to treat them with fear and derision. Some want to kill them because they want them to be out of their region, and they simply don't want to deal with them and know that they can bring trouble, while others are very curious about the goods that they bring, about their language, about their metalwork, about their animals. So this, despite the extremes, and the extremes are there, and they are not rarities, even if they're not everyday commonalities, there are complexities. And let me show you how some of these complexities play out just to end this lecture. This is an image from something called a Costa painting. And these Costa paintings were basically sociological studies of New World people. And this Costa painting is really fascinating because what does it show? It shows when people marry, when people have different backgrounds and they marry, they create a new world person who has brought these two backgrounds together and has traits and attributes of both backgrounds. And then that person, that new person who's created through intermarriage, carries a label. And sometimes those labels are pretty derisive in these costume paintings, but at other times they are not. So what is going on here? Whoops, we're not quite there yet. We see a woman of Spanish background, the Española, described here, in very, very elegant dress. This is a woman who does not work. She is a gentlewoman. Her voluminous skirts and her clean linens show that she is a lady of leisure. She is what you would call a gentlewoman. And she is a white Spaniard. Who is her husband? Her husband is a man of color, of African background. And the fact that he is called what in Spanish was a negro, or a black man, indicates that, like she is of 100% European background, he is of 100% African background. But what is his story? He is very wealthy. He's wearing clothing that is made out of gold and red fabric, extremely expensive, just as her blue fabric and their little child's blue fabric is extremely expensive. He is wearing on his leg what's called a chap. And a chap was worn by a man who owned a horse, when not everybody owned horses. And this is probably a man who rides for leisure. And then his clothing is completely incompatible with work, just as hers is, meaning that he too is a gentleman. He is a property owner. He is somebody of very high status, and he's somebody who leads and who makes decisions by virtue of his wealth rather than works for a living. What does this tell us? That if you came from what would have been considered by the Spanish a pure background, that is really what mattered in terms of marriages and alliances. There are people of color in the Spanish New World who represent the trading houses of powerful African monarchs. Not all people who come from Africa to the New World come there involuntarily and come enslaved. Some of them are very wealthy and are at the apex of their society. That is something the Spanish recognize. In addition, if you were a wealthy Spanish woman and the men who were trying to marry you, let's say one was this man here, who is a wealthy man of African origin, and the other is a Spaniard from lower down the socioeconomic order, you would marry the wealthy African. So this tells us something about race and racism. It does not have to be. It does not have to come out that way. The Spanish have an empire and a social pecking order that has a very, very, very strong class dimension to it. And that very, very strong class dimension is based on what your background is, what your status is, more than what your skin color is. And here we see it at work as from this kind of living, it's not a living document, it's a painted document, but from this glimpse of the past of the Spanish Empire. And then, of course, this man and this woman are married, and they have this little boy here who's only shown riding a ram. Normally, children did not do that. That is ill-advised, but it's showing that he is a conqueror of nature. And that's considered kind of a good thing or an important thing. And he is a type of person known as a mulatto or a mulata if you are female. That's somebody with one white parent and one black parent. And he too is dressed very richly. Here's a really interesting key for deciphering the visual world that we're encountering this semester. this little boy who looks to me to be about 6 or 7 or 8 years old is wearing shoes. And a lot of kids did not wear shoes in early America, especially in warmer climates, because children's feet grow fast, shoes are expensive and hard to come by. A little child wearing fancy shoes is a child of wealth indeed, illustrating to us that the coming together of peoples is more determined by your class rather than your race or your background. I'm sorry, rather than your race. One thing we can say conclusively about this marriage, this man, through either conversion or because he came from a Catholic part of Africa, of which there were several by the time you get to the 1500s, they were both Catholic, kind of indisputable. So let's wrap up by looking at a few more of these castas. And this is one of my favorites. I love this one, and I'll tell you why. Because in this one, the wife's eyes are kind of averted, looking down. The husband has a look of confidence on his face, but the wife looks kind of very demure, and that's kind of a very gendered response to how you comport yourself in the world. Your eyes are downcast. You're a woman after all. What are you supposed to be looking at? And that is kind of an indication that you're appropriately womanly. When we get to this image here, we see another well-off family from a different Costa painting. There were many of these. And they're not probably not as wealthy as the other family that we've just seen, but they're most certainly wealthy enough. The woman is wearing a skirt of a very beautiful fabric. The husband is wearing clean white linens and a great coat. You would really not wear this to work. This was not practical working clothing, which means he is probably a successful farmer. And his wife is a woman of color. She is the one who has the upward glare and is giving some sort of gesture to him. And there's kind of a great equanimity between the two of these that I find, the two of these folks that I find to be very, very appealing. And then what's going on in this image here, their child, a little girl, again, wearing clean linens, beautiful, rich blue, and a little embroidered shawl, and she has a treat of an orange or some sort of tropical fruit, is cuddled in the arms of her father. So this is really kind of a touching family sequence, and also one that highlights this idea that racial background mattered less than your status, or and that, you know, love and companionate relationships were important ones. Here, likewise interesting, the husband is of European background, and who is the wife? The wife is from a noble Indian family, probably one that converted to Catholicism, either because it was the politically expedient thing to do, or because it appealed to someone in the family and the rest of the family went with them, or some combination of factors. But here he is, again, very wealthy. He's not even wearing his own hair. He's wearing a wig. You never wore something like that for work. You only did it for show. It means that you're kind of an important man in the world. And look at these completely impractical cuffs for any form of work. And then he has his side piece here, his sword. So he is kind of decked out. He looks like an administrator. And who is his wife? His wife is of Native American extraction, full and complete. Again, what joins them together? Class, status, and Catholicism. What makes this image very interesting is that we have their little child here, and I can't tell what the child is, but the husband is kind of grasping his child's arm, and the wife is kind of looking on at the scene. But then who is carrying the child? A servant. And her skin is clearly darker. She is a little girl of Native American descent, which tells us something too. This spectrum of how Native people are treated is pretty broad. Wealthy Native people, by the time we get to the 17th century, are going to be considered very desirable marriage partners for Spanish men, or vice versa. But Native people who are poorer are seen as being farther down on the scale. And that's definitely the case with this Costa painting here, where we have a Native man married to a woman of color and their little boy. You can kind of contrast this from the previous pictures. So here we have this little boy, and he's wearing this beautiful little coat and shoes and kind of enjoying his life of leisure with his parents. This child here, who has considerably darker skin because he's the result of intermarriage between an African woman and a Native American man, is a working child. He has clothes, but they are ragged clothes. He's not wearing any shoes. He is most likely a child who already helps his parents in their enterprise. And what do his parents do? It's really hard to tell. Conceivably, some sort of preparation of food, which they sell. The mother seems better dressed than the father, so the father might be a day laborer, and the mother might have a skill that involves food that makes the family kind of function economically. So I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of the idea that this is an era of complete racial neutrality and blindness. It is not. However, in many cases, class and nobility in the Spanish Empire, as well as wealth, are going to triumph over any consideration of background, be it Native American, African, or European. And what we're very quickly going to get in the Spanish New World are huge stratas of mixed background people and robust intermarriage between Africans, that is, Africans who are free people of color, of which there are many in the Spanish New World, Native Americans, and Native American survivors, and Europeans. All colonizers are different, and we're going to be really learning these differences in the next 2 weeks. You'll find out in the weeks to come precisely how different the English and the French are in their New World experiences. I hope to see some folks in the drill down session on Friday. A really interesting reading about maritime technology. I love, love, love it, and I look forward to sharing it with you.